"This is a restricted area, sir." The guard's voice was steady, carrying the stiffness of a protocol, repeated far too many times. The man standing before the gate didn't respond. He merely gave a slight nod in agreement, but because he had grown too accustomed to the silence behind closed gates. His cap was worn neatly, his old olive green uniform now faded to a silver gray hue, yet every stitch still sat sharply in place, like the pair of frail shoulders beneath, doing their best to remain upright. In his hand, a single white tulip, its petals already wilting after more than 200 miles of intercity bus travel, trembled gently in the Pacific breeze. No one noticed him. No camera turned in his direction. At Fort Rosecrans National Cemetery, where a state funeral was being held for General Daniel R3, Whitaker, all eyes were fixed on the rows of generals, high-ranking officers, politicians, and the bagpipe ensemble preparing for the final rites. Inside that space lived a world of titles, medals, and ceremonial precision. Outside stood a forgotten veteran, Edward Eddie Marshall, 74 years old, like a shadow at the edge of history. He didn't argue. He didn't explain. No one asked him to leave, but no one invited him in either. Perhaps they assumed he was a lost passerby, or worsey pretender. But within every crease of his weathered face, in the way he stood still as if guarding something sacred there, lived a truth invisible to the naked eye. He hadn't come to be honored. He had come to say goodbye to the man who once called him brother, not on paper, but in the trenches. It wasn't an insult. It was a forgetting. And in the backdrop of that flawless funeral, that forgetting became the first fracture, one that would lead to a story none of them could have expected. Beyond the towering black iron gates of Fort Rosecrans, the world inside seemed arranged in perfect order. Rows of white chairs lined neatly beneath the sprawling eucalyptus trees, while in the distance, the still waters of San Diego Bay shimmered gently beneath the soft rays of the morning sun filtering through the mist. A light breeze swept past, rustling the American flags planted along the walkway leading to the Memorial Plaza. In that space, every detail exuded solemnity and reverence. The ceremony that day was no ordinary funeral. It was a state burial for General Daniel R. Whitaker, living legend of the United States military, who had led covert operations stretching from the Middle East to Southeast Asia over more than 3 decades. His name was etched into the annals of strategic victories, leadership case studies taught at West Point, and even congressional hearings where he defended the honor of the soldiers under his command. The presence of high-ranking figures from the Secretary of Defense and top generals to representatives of Allied force elevated the event into a national occasion. Camera lenses were fixed on the center stage. Medals gleamed under the bright morning sun, casting cold but proud metallic reflections. At the far end of the walkway, the bagpipe ensemble stood poised, ready to sound the somber notes of taps as the moment approached. Every guest had to pass through meticulous security names checked against the guest list, military IDs scanned under optical lights, and rank insignias carefully verified. Precision wasn't just protocol, it was principle. No one was permitted entry unless their name was pre-approved. Not even former officers. Not even those who had once fought alongside General Whitaker. Inside the grounds, the honor guard moved in perfect rhythm, their synchronized steps like a silent melody, so flawless that time itself seemed to pause. Yet within that perfection, something was missing, or more precisely, someone was missing. No one noticed. No one remembered the name Edward Marshall. No one knew that just outside the fence stood a man who had once saved the life of the very general being honored at that ceremony. And he stood there not expecting to be invited in, nor needing to be welcokedly wishing to say goodbye, in the same way he had lived, quietly, without fanfare, but never insignificant. Less than 20 steps from the main gate, Eddie Marshall still stood, a near invisible figure in the shimmering light of a day meant for remembrance. No name tag, no invitation, no escort, just an elderly man, slightly hunched, wearing a time-worn uniform pressed with care down to each precise crease. His brown leather shoes had been polished to a soft gleam. His cap sat properly in place, and in his hand was a single white tulip, its stem neatly bound with an old ribbon. The young guard, perhaps no older than 25, glanced at him once before speaking. "This area is reserved for a private funeral. I'm sorry, Sirdo. You have an invitation?" Eddie quietly shook his head. His pale blue-gray eyes, faded by time, still held an almost otherworldly calm. He didn't argue. He didn't explain. He didn't plead. He simply said, "I came to say goodbye to an old comrade." Then he stepped back 2 paces and stood silently by the iron fence, on the edge of the world he had once belonged to. His silence carried no resentment, only a quiet kind of waiting. Steady, unshaken, as if he were still guarding some invisible front line. Every breeze stirred his jacket slightly, and the tulip trembled in his hand, not from cold, but as if echoing something deeper from within his heart. All these years, Eddie had never asked anything from the country he served, and today, he asked for nothing still. He only wanted to keep a promise never written down, but always understood, to be there on the final day, to see his brother in arms laid to rest. Inside, they were adjusting dress sashes, preparing for the flag-folding ceremony, checking the guest list one last time. Outside, Eddie still stood, like a living statue. None among the gathered dignitaries knew that the man being turned away was the very one who had pulled Daniel Whitaker out of enemy fire in 1969. In the Aishau Valley, no one saw the faded scar on his shoulder, where a bullet had passed through as he returned to save a second comrade. No one knew, except for Eddie and the men who were no longer alive to tell the story. And so, at a funeral where every movement was choreographed to protocol, something small but profound was quietly unfolding. An old soldier, silently, keeping his final promise, even as the world inside had already forgotten him. But like every warrior who served in silence, Eddie Marshall didn't need to be reminded to be worthy. He only needed to be present, and he was. Among the countless eyes fixed on the center of the ceremony, where the flag-draped casket was being carried to its place of honor, only one gaze quietly turned in another direction, toward the cemetery gate, where an old man stood silently beneath the shade of a tree. Colonel Patrick Monroe, once an aide to General Whitaker, had glanced that way instinctively after hearing the soft scrape of a shoelace against gravel. At first, he didn't think much of it, until he saw a faded red patch on the left shoulder of a worn uniform. Long-Range Recon Patrol, Vietnam 1969. Patrick stepped forward, squinting. It couldn't be. It couldn't be him. But then, like a flood of memory released at once, came the image from a blurred old photo, the story General Whitaker often told. Whenever he spoke of Hill 937, that man didn't wait for orders. He just appeared when there was almost no one left alive. Patrick turned swiftly back toward the podium, where General Matthew Pricenow, the commanding officer, and one of the soldiers rescued alongside Whitaker that day, stood solemnly beside the fallen general's portrait. Leaning in, barely moving his lips, Patrick whispered, "Sir, he's here, Eddie Marshall." General Price froze just for a beat. Then, without a word, he removed his white gloves and gave a single, firm nod. The ceremony paused. No explanation was given. No one knew what was happening, only that a four-star general had just stepped out of formation and was walking with purpose toward the cemetery gate, toward a man who didn't know that his name had just been spoken aloud. For the first time in decades, Eddie looked up and recognized a face that had aged, but still held the same fire he'd once seen in battle. When General Price stopped a few feet away, Eddie stood at attention, back straight, as if he still wore the uniform daily. And then, in front of officials, cameras, and high-ranking military personnel, an arm rose cleanly. A formal salute offered not to a subordinate, but to an equal. "Sergeant Marshal," General Price said, his voice low and thick with emotion. "We've been waiting for you." Eddie shook his head slightly, about to speak, but the general cut him off with a firm voice. "With all due respect, sir, yes, we have." No more words were needed. The presence of Eddie Marshall, a soldier, with no name tag, no file, no medals on his chest, was now acknowledged, not by rank, but by remembrance. And something shifted, not in the ceremony, but in the hearts of those who witnessed it, in that fleeting moment, suddenly made eternal. No one moved. Hundreds of eyes, camera lenses, and unspoken doubts turned toward the cemetery gate, where a four-star general now stood in salute to a man most of the guests had never heard of. Then, before the full force of the standing military present at this state funeral, General Matthew Price gave a quiet signal to his aide. A young soldier stepped forward, carrying a polished mahogany box, a small object, yet heavier than any metal ever earned. Inside was the cremated remains of General Daniel R. Whitaker, a man being honored by a nation today who had endured 3 wars, served 30 tireless years, and trained hundreds of future officers, but who, over half a century ago, had been pulled from enemy fire by the very man who had stood outside this gate. No drums, no fanfare, only the sound of heavy, proud footsteps as General Price walked to Eddie Marshall, and placed the box in his hands, with both hands, as though passing back a piece of history. His voice trembled as he spoke. "He asked for you. He wanted you to take him home." Eddie bowed his head, his weathered hands lifting the box, as if it were the final debt he owed a friend, not because of war, but because of a brotherhood that had no name. His lips moved, but no words came. Only his eyes spoke, not of being honored, but of finally being seen. And just then, from deeper within the cemetery, a small group of men stood. No announcement, no command, just instinct or memory. Old soldiers, hair now gray, backs now bent, who had once served in the long-range recon patrol, rose one by one and raised their hands in salute to Eddie. Not because he was a general, not because of protocol, but because they remembered, they recognized, and they knew. Only he could lead this final journey. And when Eddie Marshall walked through the iron gates, carrying the ashes of his fallen comrade, he was no longer the man left outside. He had become the one who led the farewell procession, not of a marching band, but of remembrance. For a hero remembered by a nation, because of a hero the nation had forgotten. When Eddie Marshall placed his hands on the wooden urn at the funeral, time seemed to collapse in on itself. The cold from the smooth mahogany surface seeped slowly into his palms, dragging with it a memory buried beneath half a century of dust. At Chau Valley, Vietnam, May 1969. It was the 19th day of the campaign. Jungle rain crashed down like thunder. The forest was a swamp of mud, leeches crawling up collars, and no one had slept more than an hour in days. That night, when the radio blared with chaos, Edithan, a 28-year-old staff sergeant Todd, been assigned to guard the outer perimeter. But what he heard wasn't an order. It was a cry for help. Lerp Bravo trapped outside the eastern perimeter. We have casualties. He didn't wait. He didn't ask for permission. He stuffed 2 white smoke grenades into his chest pocket, slung a med kit over his shoulder, and ran. He tore through razor wire, burst through the trees, and into a forest lit up with enemy fire. Bullets tore in every direction. But he didn't stop. He found them 3 soldiers pinned behind a fallen log. One of them was Lieutenant Daniel Whitaker, shot in the shoulder and barely conscious. Another was Precious, face caked in mud, desperately trying to keep the radio alive. New questions, new words. Eddie dropped the smoke grenades, hoisted each man one by one, dragging them across every inch of ground as if he were dragging his own life behind him. And just as they crossed back into the perimeter, a mortar shell tore into Eddie's side. They lived. He fell. Word of what he had done traveled fast. Command recommended the Silver Star. Others nominated him for a Purple Heart. Eddie refused. I only did what I had to do, he said. Months later, he was transferred to a U.S. base in Okinawa for recovery. Then, without ceremony, without farewell, he quietly left the service. No goodbyes. No one noticed. He disappeared from the military the same way he'd entered, silently, not out of bitterness, not out of disappointment, but because war, in his heart, was never something to retell. It was a living wound, and sometimes survival is the hardest punishment of all. He had lost too many. He had heard too many last words, and he carried them all, away from a world he could no longer endure. Since then, Edward Marshall had never spoken of that day. He never bragged, never complained, and that's why, when he returned to the funeral today, no one knew he had once saved the very men now standing at the podium. But some, the ones who remembered, had not forgotten, and to them, his silence was the purest symbol of loyalty they had ever known. As Edward Eddie Marshall stepped deeper into the center of the ceremony, through rows of unfamiliar, indifferent eyes, he expected nothing. No seat of honor, no nameplate, no grand introduction, only the wooden urn in his hands, heavy with memory, and a white tulip, now wilting after hours of waiting outside the gate. He didn't know that, in the very last row of seats, a group of men had begun to rise quietly. No orders, no gestures, just something invisible passing among them. They were older now, in plain clothes, silver-haired, eyes seasoned by time, but they recognized him. One nodded slowly. Another raised a hand in salute, not rushed, but firm. And then, like a ripple in the air, they stood, one by one. They didn't care if his name was on an official list. They didn't care about rank, title, or what the record books remembered. They saw a soldier standing tall as he once did every morning in uniform, bringing a brother home. And that was enough. Some younger officers began to notice. There were puzzled looks. Some bowed their heads instinctively. And then, a hush settled over the entire ceremony. Not a word spoken. Yet everyone present understood. They were witnessing something rare. A hero being restored to his honor. Not through a speech, but through the silent recognition of those who truly understood its worth. Edward did not turn around. Maybe he didn't see it all. Maybe he never expected to. But one thing was certain. He felt it. Just like soldiers once felt each other, through the fog of gunfire and the static of broken radios. An invisible connection, stronger than any ceremony. And so, in a moment, unscripted, unrecorded in any program. Edward Marshall was acknowledged, not by applause, but by the silent rising of those who had once walked through the same war. No microphone, no spotlight, just memory and the quiet truth. They still remembered, and that was enough. After that moment of silence, when the old soldiers quietly stood to salute him, another movement began. General Matthew Price, after watching in silence for several minutes, stepped up to the podium, not according to the program, not waiting for the MC to call his name. He simply walked deliberate and unwavering, carrying something he knew had to be said. Because if it wasn't spoken now, the truth would be buried once more. He removed his white gloves and set them aside. And then, before hundreds of high-ranking officers, national media, government representatives, and the family of General Whitaker, he picked up the microphone, not to praise the fallen, but to honor the man standing before them. Today, we gather to bid farewell to a national hero general, Daniel R. Whitaker. But before anyone comes up here to speak of his victories, his leadership, and his courage, I ask permission to speak of someone else. The crowd fell still. General Price looked down at the aging soldier, still standing tall, still holding the urn. If not for Edward Marshall, Daniel wouldn't have lived to see 25. I wouldn't have survived my first mission, and hundreds more trained, inspired, and protected by Daniel might never have existed at all. He paused. His eyes were red, not from grief, but from the truth finally spoken aloud. We often award medals to those listed in official reports, but today, I declare before every witness here that Mr. Edward Marshall is the soul of this ceremony. Not because he asked for it, but because it is time at last to remember. The plaza was silent, and then, like a wave moving backward from the heart, hats were removed. From officer rows, to young enlisted troops, to even the press, everyone stood. No camera clicks, no whispered chatter, just reverence. Pure, quiet reverence, sweeping through the crowd like an unspoken anthem. In that moment, beneath the fluttering flags and rows of silent white chairs, the man once left outside the gates was, for the first time, and perhaps the last, saluted by an entire nation. He didn't need a medal pinned to his chest, because that day, he was etched into memory. When the ceremony ended, the white chairs were folded away, the gloves were removed, and people began to leave Fort Rosecrans Cemetery. But Eddie Marshall remained, quiet, beneath the shade of an eucalyptus tree. In front of him stood a freshly placed headstone, simple, unadorned. Daniel R. Whitaker, brother, commander, friend. Eddie knelt, his knees lowering slowly, not out of the ceremony, but age. From his coat pocket, he drew a small incense stick, something he'd kept from his days in Southeast Asia. No one had taught him this. It was simply his way, a mark of respect for the departed, for comrades, for all the words that could never be said. He whispered, just loud enough for the wind to carry. I came, Dan. I kept my promise. And this time, you can rest. A pause. Then, through the haze of incense smoke, a faint smile crossed his face. I know you never liked flowers. As he stood, he was no longer alone. General Matthew Price was beside him, a small, yellowed envelope in his hand. This was in Dan's safe, he said. He left one condition. Only give it to you if you ever showed up. Eddie opened the letter. Just a few lines, handwritten shaky. Frank, you never let me thank you, but I owe you everything. If they ever say my name, I want them to say yours too. Because if I died with honor, it's only because you once chose not to leave me behind. Eddie folded the letter and placed it inside his coat, close to his heart. He said nothing. He didn't need to. His eyes said more than words ever could. 1 year later, under the warm California spring sun, the Edward Marshall Veterans Recovery Center was dedicated. A place not just for healing wounds of the body, but for the quiet, lingering memories that so many veterans carry through life. There were no long speeches. Eddie didn't appear on stage. He simply stood at a distance, wearing the same old coat, holding a single white tulip, just like always. And this time, he didn't need to walk through the gates, because his legacy was already there, living in every brick, every bench, every softened gaze of the young soldiers, trying to figure out how to keep going. He didn't need anyone to shout his name. He just needed a place where those like him, the quiet ones, could be remembered, healed, and welcomed home. Maybe the most extraordinary part of this story wasn't in the protocols, or the reserved seats, or the microphone on the dais. It was in one old soldier who once walked away in silence, but returned with the deepest honor a human being can receive: recognition from those who walked through the same darkness. Edward Marshall never needed to be remembered as a hero, but in his humility, in his unwavering loyalty until the end, he left behind a legacy no applause could match. Not everyone who saves you wants to be celebrated, but one day, when you're finally wise enough to look back, be the one who stands up and says, "I remember. Thank you, sir."